You know, we're just obsessed with happiness, aren't we? It's the whole point of our therapies, it's the big promise on all our products, and it's that one central question of our lives: am I happy? But what if I told you that this question, this whole obsession, is actually a pretty recent invention? So let's dive in and take a look at the fascinating history of where our modern idea of happiness really came from.
So there's this fantastic story about the French president, Charles de Gaulle. He's at a dinner, right? And someone asks his wife what she's most looking forward to in retirement, and she just says, a penis. Well, you can imagine the painfully awkward silence. Finally, her husband leans over and gently corrects her. My dear, I believe in English the word is pronounced happiness. It's a hilarious story, but it gets at something really important. Happiness can be a super tricky thing to define, and its meaning, well, it hasn't always been what we think it is.
So the big question is this whole happiness thing timeless? I mean, have we been asking, am I happy since, like, Aristotle? Well, the answer is kinda yes and no. See, the idea that you and I can be happy, and not just can be, but should be happy, as just a normal part of life, that's actually a pretty radical and really modern idea.
Just take this great line from the 18th century writer Samuel Johnson. He wasn't just being a cynic here. He was actually capturing the way most people thought for most of human history. The idea was that happiness wasn't something you felt in the sober light of day. Nah, it was a memory, or maybe a hope for the future, or, a fleeting, altered state. Definitely not a baseline for living.
Right. So if happiness wasn't this internal feeling you had to work on, then what was it? For pretty much all of our ancestors, the answer was really simple. It was luck, pure and simple. Something that just happened to you, not something you made yourself.
And the evidence for this is actually baked right into our language, which I think is fascinating. The root of our word happy is hap, which is an old word for luck or chance. That's where we get words like happenstance and perhaps. And it's not just English. The French word for happiness, bonheur, literally means good fortune. The German word, Glück, still means both happiness and luck today. The words themselves are telling us that for centuries, happiness was just what fate decided to give you.
So when you put it side by side like this, you can see just how massive this shift in thinking really is. For the ancient world, happiness was this external thing. It was fragile, it was rare, and it was totally controlled by the gods or the stars. But for us, in the modern world, it's an internal state. It's a personal goal, something we achieve, and honestly, for a lot of us, it's a basic expectation of life. I mean, this change in thinking is seriously one of the biggest revolutions in human history.
And sure, the great thinkers of the past definitely talked about happiness, but not at all like we do. For the ancient Greeks, the goal wasn't really happiness as in a good feeling, it was eudaimonia. Think of that as a full, flourishing life, a life of excellence, which you often got by using your virtue to triumph over bad luck. And for a lot of religious traditions, suffering was just the default setting. Happiness was this extraordinary, almost divine exception to the rule. Aristotle even called the happy few. It was a prize for being virtuous, not some right everyone had.
But then, along came the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and everything changed. I mean, a massive cultural shift happened that completely rewrote the rules on what it means to be human and what we could expect from life. And here was the revolutionary idea. All of a sudden, happiness wasn't some rare gift from the gods. It wasn't a prize for a few heroes. Nope. It was declared to be the natural condition of every single human being. It was our birthright.
And you can actually see this idea just explode across the 18th century. It kicks off with philosophers like John Locke, who flat out says that the business of man is to be happy. Pretty soon it's being written into law. You've got the 1776 Virginia Declaration of Rights, which talks about pursuing and obtaining happiness. And yeah, that phrase directly influenced Thomas Jefferson's more famous pursuit of happiness. The whole thing kind of culminates during the French Revolution, when a leader stands up in the middle of all that chaos and declares, happiness is a new idea.
Now, this was a super liberating revolution in a lot of ways. I mean, it gave us permission to actually enjoy life and try to reduce suffering. But this new belief also came with a huge and often unspoken burden. Because here's the kicker, right? If you're told you can be happy and you should be happy, what happens if you're not? What does that mean? Does it mean you failed? Is there something wrong with you?
This is what the historian Darren McMahon calls the unhappiness of not being happy. And it's a uniquely modern problem.
Think about it. When happiness becomes this goal we're all supposed to achieve, not having it creates a whole new kind of misery. It's this feeling of personal failure, or guilt, or even resentment that somebody else is keeping you from what you're owed.
By the 19th century, you already had critics like Thomas Carlyle who were just furious about this new sense of entitlement. He complained that everybody, even the pitifulest whipster, now walked around thinking they ought to be happy, demanding that life just hand them a steady stream of pleasant things. He didn't see this as freedom, he saw it as a recipe for being disappointed all the time. Around that same time, this French observer, Alexis de Tocqueville, noticed something really odd about Americans. They had all this freedom, all this prosperity, but he saw this strange melancholy just hanging over them. And this really points to the great paradox of happiness. Sometimes, the more you desperately chase it, the more it seems to just slip away. So this pressure to be happy, it also got us tangled up in a whole new set of moral questions. Like we're in a maze. If my personal happiness is the #1 goal, then what do I owe to other people on my way there?
The philosopher Cicely Boak actually has a really great framework for this. She says we should pause and ask ourselves these yes, but questions. So whenever someone offers you a path to happiness, you ask, yes, but what's the impact on other people? Could this make me cruel or dishonest? What kind of person am I becoming while I chase this? And what do I owe other people, even if it means I have to sacrifice some of my own happiness? These are tough questions that force us to look beyond just how we feel.
You know, for the ancient philosophers, this moral maze wasn't really a thing. For them, goodness and happiness were basically two sides of the same coin. To be a good person, to be courageous and just and wise, that's what it meant to live a flourishing, happy life. You couldn't separate the two.
But then, the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant comes along and just shatters that connection. He says, look, of course we all want to be happy, but that's not the moral question. For Kant, what really matters isn't whether you are happy, but whether you are worthy of happiness. Doing the right thing might actually make you miserable, he said, but that's what makes you worthy. And that is a pretty radical and challenging idea to wrestle with.
And all of this kind of brings us to this really powerful quote from John Stuart Mill. And this is a guy who spent his whole life thinking about how to make people happy. He just perfectly captured that central paradox we've been talking about. The more you intensely focus on your own happiness, the more likely it is to just disappear.
So this whole journey through the history of happiness leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought. This revolutionary idea that we all have a right to chase after and even get happiness, it shaped our world in a million different ways. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Has making happiness the absolute central goal of life actually made us any happier? That's something that's definitely worth thinking about.
Thank you for watching the video. If you like the content we make, press like and subscribe to our channel.